as you can see, I'm subcontinental, born in Sri Lanka. Mum and Dad were traditional Anglicans, and they came to know the Lord through an Anglican evangelical pastor back in the 60s. I was the youngest of four, so I got taken to church morning, evening, and night. We'd go to church in the morning, Sunday school in the afternoon, church in the evening. And I made a profession of faith when I was about 10 or 11. We came to Australia in 71. But as I grew up in my teen years, I can remember I was more interested in the rugby match I'd played, or cricket, or party, or the girl I was interested in. I can remember sitting in church and thinking, how could God be here? I started law and took a year off after my first year, worked as a jackaroo for a while north of Sejuna, earned some money and went traveling overseas. I got to Bangladesh and I met an Australian volunteer worker there, and we started having discussions about God. And I started to lose the arguments, and I didn't like that. He gave me then Screwtape Letters to read. Now, if you know Screwtape Letters, it's one of C.S. Lewis's books. It's letters from a senior devil to a junior devil. And in one of the parts, the senior devil tells the junior devil to get the man he was working on to hurt someone he loved. And I was sharing a room with this fella, and it hit me right between the eyes that before I'd left, I'd said something to my sister, which I knew it would hurt, and I meant it to hurt. And I knew that God hated that. I didn't know what to do, so I just knelt down by the side of my bed. And I went on from there to Calcutta in India. And I went to Church of England Evensong, 6 o'clock Sunday night in St. Paul's Cathedral in one of the side chapels. There were 3 people in the church, the minister up the front, a lady up the front, and myself at the back. And he spoke from John 14. And this is an example of the importance of preaching, because he could well have not preached that night. But from John 14, where Philip says to Jesus, Lord, show us the Father and we shall be satisfied. And Jesus said, have I been with you so long, and yet you do not know me, Philip? He that has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? And he said, we could grow up in a church, which I had. We could know all the stories, which I did, or some of them anyway. But we may never have met God. And I knew I hadn't. And he said, to meet God, you've got to meet Jesus Christ. And that day, that night, I just, what I said? I said, yeah. And as I left the church, I had a sense of peace that I never felt before. And I knew it was more than a feeling, because I got into a bus. I was staying at the Salvos, the Red Shield in Calcutta, and there was a girl sitting on the other side of the bus, and I thought to look at her like I would have before, but I thought, no, I don't want to lose this feeling. I stayed on for a little while. I worked with Mother Teresa's Missionary Brothers of Charity. I was thinking of joining them, and on Christmas Eve 1977, I met Mother Teresa, and I asked her, what should I do? She said, I'll never forget this as long as I live. She said, go home. If God wants you here, he'll bring you back. So I came back, continued with law, joined a group, got involved in a group called the Navigators at University, which was a disciple-making ministry. And the passion gripped my heart, talking about the Great Commission, to help fulfill the Great Commission by making a deep impact in the lives of the few. Went to the country. Amanda, my wife, she went to the country as well. We worked together in the NAVs. We both came back to Adelaide, started going out, got married, 4 children, who are now all young adults. And through that time, I'd meet with men and share the word. We'd read the Bible together, and that was my passion. But I'd always had an interest in politics. As a family, growing up, we'd come home from church on a Sunday and have political discussions. And then in about 2011, I was up the back veranda, painting the back veranda on a summer's day, and Ross Phillips from Family Voice rang me. It's called Festival of Light in those days. And she said, there's a euthanasia bill going down. We can't get anybody to help us. Will you write something? So I said, sure. So I wrote something, contacted another barrister friend of mine, and we put it together and sent it off. And that bill was defeated, thankfully. Sadly, we lost this year. Then the next year, the same-sex marriage debate was on. There was a national day of prayer. We didn't go, but we prayed together as a family. And I'm sure as a result of that, God put it on my heart to do some work about looking at whether the feds could legislate for same-sex marriage constitutionally. And I found there were authorities in our favor, wrote a paper, the same barrister sort of co-signed it, and we sent it off to all the MPs. There was then committees in the House of Reps in Canberra and the Senate looking at this issue. We sent our paper off and we were asked to appear. And we did that. And through that, we met Lyle Shelton from the Australian Christian Lobby. Lyle then invited us to go to Tasmania to speak to the upper house, which had a same-sex marriage bill. It had passed the lower house. We went there, we told them you can't do it because it's contrary to federal law. And that was defeated. We then went to Sydney and said the same thing. In Adelaide, there was even a bill in Norfolk Island, which we put submissions in, and that was stopped. And then there was the big issue here, the big same-sex marriage debate in 2017. A year before that, there was the election. And we had a group called Save Marriage Coalition SA with Ros Phillips and David Phillips and others. And I said, look, there's no one running the campaign here. Should I do it? They said, yes. So my wife and I ran the campaign. Then in 2017, when the same-sex marriage campaign came up, ACL asked us to run it. So we ran the No campaign here in South Australia, and they paid us something for that. And then the year after that, it became clear that ACL needed representation here. So I started first 2 days a week, and now I'm 4 days a week, and I run my barrister's practice in the rest of the time. So that's a bit of a background of who I am and how we've got to this point. Just excuse me, I've just got a bit of a cough. I just want to share my screen. So Australian Christian Lobby started many years ago in Queensland. John Gagliardi was a pastor in a big Pentecostal church, and he started the movement. And he then approached Jim Wallace. Jim was going to be the head of the army, and he asked him if he'd run ACL. So Jim took it on. He took a leave of absence from the ADF and began to develop Australian Christian Lobby. After 9/11, the government wanted him to come back as a counterterrorism expert, and he was thinking of doing that. A lady rang him up and said, look, God's told me to, God's got a word for you. And he said, okay. He said, I'm a Baptist, I don't believe in things like that. But anyway, she came to see him and said, God's told me that you should keep going what you started. So he did. He consulted to the ADF, but he ran ACL. He then handed over to Lyle Shelton. At that time, we had about 20,000 supporters across the country. Lyle ran it for a number of years. He was the face of the marriage campaign. And then after the marriage campaign, he decided it was time for him to hand over. By then, he had grown to 100,000 supporters. And he handed over to a young Martin Arles. Martin had been chief of staff, and also he and I worked together to set up a group called the Human Rights Law Alliance. I'll tell you a bit about that in a minute. He'd been to Europe for the Reformation tour in 2017, and on his way back, he was praying. He was touched by what these men had done, and he said, Lord, I haven't done anything. How can you use me? And he sensed the word from Isaiah 6, here am I, send me. And he said, yeah, I'll do whatever you want. The plane landed. He put his phone on as the plane was taxiing into Sydney Airport, and Lyle Shelton was on the phone. He said, Martin, can I talk? He said, if you know Lyle, he's always very quick. Can I talk? He said, yeah, I've just put the phone on, just landed. He said, look, I'm resigning from ACL. I'd like you to take it over. And Martin thought, oh, no, I wasn't meant to be that quick. But he sought the Lord. And a verse that God laid on his heart was from Isaiah 59, truth is fallen in the public square. And he thought, that's right. And so the motto that ACL's moved to is truth made public. And now we've grown to be about 200,000 supporters, a database of about 500,000, but 200,000 people who are actually supporters. And we're represented right across the country. So that's a bit of a snapshot of ACL. But I want to take you back to Caesarea Philippi as Jesus takes his disciples up among all the pagan statues, and he asked the great question of Peter, who do you say that I am? And Peter makes the great confession, you are the Christ. And Jesus then says, you are Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And that's very important, because the church, that basically the followers of the Lord, were constituted, created always as an offensive unit. It's very important to remember that in our world, because we face in Australia a real crisis. If you run through the laws that are now laws in our country, we're throwing off God's laws. So South Australia this year, we passed abortion to birth and assisted suicide. Western Australia has got assisted suicide. They're planning to bring in what's called gay conversion therapy laws, which are meant to suppress the preaching of the gospel. Northern Territory and ACT want to do the same thing. Queensland has abortion to birth, and it's going to bring in assisted suicide. So the case in New South Wales. Victoria has gone far ahead of everybody else. Tasmania is very close. And as a barrister, I've represented people across the country who've basically been either disciplined or being taken to a tribunal because of their faith. So in South Australia, a young student basically was suspended in a university because he prayed for someone, and a few other things. West Australia, there's a case going on at the moment, a couple, Christian couple, who because of their belief in sexuality and gender have been stopped proceeding to be in their application to be foster parents. And that's repeated across the country. And it's easy to get a sort of a sense of foreboding and gloom. But the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church of God. And there is, in amongst all this pressure and move away from God, there's a real hunger in people. This is a picture of the Brisbane Town Hall earlier this year for Martin Niles and the ACL's Truth of It live tour. Truth of It is a podcast Martin does, and he's been doing meetings around Queensland. He's coming around the country, coming here on the 18th of September. A couple of years ago, we had our state conference, our national conference in Sydney, 1,500 people. We thought that was great. Brisbane, 1,800. The town hall is full. In Perth, they've got about 4,000. Launceston, about 1,000. South Australia, we've got about 1,000 registered. And at the moment, it'd be great to have all of you jump on the website and register. We've booked the convention centre, 2,500. There is a hunger for people to hear God's truth applied to the realities of our situation. And that's turning up, moving into what ACL wants to be a grassroots movement. This is the Walk for Life. This year, in the rain, we had about 4,500 people, the second time that's been run. And that was instrumental in, even though we lost the abortion to birth, we had significant amendments made to the legislation, which made it the best bill in Australia, a best of a bad lot. And that grassroots movement is part of what we're energizing and training and equipping people to speak into the issues of politics, to speak into power and speak truth in the public square. The big ticket item we're working on is religious freedom. The federal government promised us a religious freedom bill after the marriage campaign. It hasn't surfaced yet. There were 2 exposure drafts before COVID, and there's a third one coming, but it looks like they're trying to water it down. And so next week, we'll be having a phone-in campaign where about 600-700 trained volunteers will ring our supporters and ask them to ring their MPs and say, we want a proper bill, because our voices need to be heard. And then, of course, there's the election coming up in South Australia next year. And we're encouraging people to vote, not for parties, but for those who voted for life. These are the 20 who voted again to restrict abortion to birth. Now, the yellow highlights are people in the western suburbs. We're having a meeting there in a couple of weeks. It's prepared for that. But I want you to note that many Labor Party MPs voted against abortion to birth, including the Labour leader, and there are a lot of Liberals as well. But if you go to the other slide, it's a sad thing in our state that the Deputy Premier and the Premier voted against restricting abortion to birth. And the Premier and the Attorney General also, a couple of years ago when we had decriminalisation of prostitution, voted for decriminalisation. The Leader of the Opposition voted against it. That's rearing its head again. Next week on Thursday, I'm appearing before a upper house committee speaking against decriminalisation of prostitution. We've been working in this space with survivors from prostitution, and it's a shocking story. You hear what these women go through. There are places in Adelaide where the Chinese women work 11 hours a day, 7 days a week, and then they're transported to another city. It's actual ongoing slavery. And we're working with another group called Rehab to set up a refuge for people, women who leave the industry and who need a safe place to be retrained. They need to be retrained in all of their lives. And that's another great project I'd bring to your attention. The other thing we do is training. So I want to play this little video. It just goes for a minute about our youth training program.
We're commanded in Scripture to be the light of the world. And we found that for many people that they couldn't place their faith in relation to the real world. We'll get the meeting of experts and they can talk about what it's like to be a Christian in that sphere. There is no other place in Australia where you will get that.
In science and technology, particularly cybersecurity. I was looking to see how I could navigate that field as a Christian.
For me, it's one of the best decisions I've ever made. It's so nice to just be around other people who believe the same things, get my challenge, and then how to respond to that. It's just way deeper than anything else. Don't doubt it, just do it. It's absolutely amazing.
So we run that twice a year. This year we had about 150. We couldn't run it because of COVID. Next year we're hoping to have about 300 people. You can sponsor students. If we get about 50 or 60 in Adelaide, we'll bring the program here. So it's training, it's equipping, encouraging, but it's also supporting. And so we've set up a group called a law firm, actually, a standalone law firm, the Human Rights Law Alliance, which represents Christian people who are being challenged or who are being disciplined or brought to tribunals for their faith. So we're acting for Lyle Shelton, who, because he said that adult entertainers shouldn't do drag queen story time to children, is being sued. And that's, we're representing him in the Queensland Civil Administrative Tribunal. But there's another side to this as I close, and that is, as truth is being proclaimed, people's lives have been touched. When people give money to ACL, we ring them up, and one of our staff members rang up someone a couple of weeks ago, and she asked him, "Why did you give?" And he said, "Well, you asked, I'll tell you." He said, "I was homosexual." And one of my friends told me that Martin Niles doesn't hate Christians, that doesn't hate gays. So just to show her that he was wrong, I went and listened to what Martin was saying. And I found he didn't. I found he was speaking truth. And I went to the Bible and I read it and I found that I was wrong. And now I'm a Christian and I hate the way I live. God is touching lives. Hopefully this next week, I'll be meeting with a man with a couple of friends, or a friend and a friend of a friend. This fellow, he's a scientist. He's got concern with what's happening with all the COVID stuff. And he's met with people, Christian people who prayed for him. And he rang my friend up last week and said, "Look, where should I start reading in the Bible?" And my friend told him something. And then he discovered he didn't have a Bible. So I'm going to get a Gideon's Bible and we're going to meet together, hopefully have some lunch. We can have our masks off because because we can eat and read the scriptures together. So as truth is made public, God is touching people and the gates of hell are not prevailing against the Church of God. Thank you.
Christopher, that was excellent.